given me a space or a place to feel empowered. I've never invested my time in it. I've never been interested in it. I've always seen it as a bit of a joke. I don't see myself putting any of my energy or time into trying to change Pride. I feel like it's a lost cause in the sense of I don't think there's enough people involved in it who want to recognise that change or see that change, or just kind of be honest with themselves about how the way Pride is celebrated and the people that go to it kind of perpetuate the problems with the aspects of queer liberation. So yeah, personally for me, it's not something that I'd ever really feel like I'd want to actively put my energy and time into changing, and just kind of go off and do other things to completely separate to that to make a difference.
So what are those other things this year? Because it's looking. So what I'm looking at the year at large, 2019, Stonewall 50. Where do you want to put your energy? So if it's not Pride,
well, it's just challenging narratives, challenging specifically queer PLC narratives. I've always had massive complexes with being black and queer because I've never, growing up, I didn't have representation. So my representation of queer culture is very white, very,
Absolutely.
And that's caused massive complexes within myself, with my sexuality, within the kind of guys that I'm interested in, and as I get older and I realise how those deep-rooted kind of things have affected the way I see other like the way I'm attracted to white people more than I am to black people, and I think this year I'm just going to put more energy into creating a narrative, or joining people who are already creating stronger narratives for black people, black queer people, and PLC queer people. So yeah, I find myself conflicted with especially like intersectionality and the whole term queer PLC. Like, what does it mean when you say, as a queer PLC you've got Arabs and South Asians and black people, and like even within that group you've got racism from Arab. A lot of Arab culture is very racist towards black people. I face a lot of racism from Arabs, and it's very hard to navigate under the guise of queer PLC as if we're all in the same struggle. When I always believe the black struggle is the biggest out of all of them, and that's not to dismiss that there are struggles within other PLC narratives, but the black struggle is something which is definitely
like an indigenous struggle as well. Like indigenous is such an aspect which links into black struggle so much.
Definitely jumped on by other people, and like it's definitely used as a way of progressing other people's.
Sure. It's kind of cultural capital, like social capital in a way. Like, I'm Arab, I'm Middle Eastern, and absolutely, like, I sometimes find myself demonstrating latent narratives which can be very homogenizing of the POC experience, as if we're all the same. Like, Levi and I, our experiences walking down the street are extremely different. We both define ourselves as queer people of colour, but ultimately the experiences we face are going to be very different. They're not going to tie into, we're not going to be treated the same by a kebab shop owner, we're not going to be treated the same by a police officer. There's a level of like privilege and lack of privilege which people need to be more aware of within our circles. But I just wanted to say one thing about the Pride thing. I think even though I believe that like we should reject this idea of Pride and what Pride has become, I think the concept of space is really important. And I think that like in the 21st century, even though space has become a lot more transcendent and it has taken on more like virtual forms, like borders have become more porous through like intelligence and through technology and the internet and things like that, physical space still occupies a massive part of resistance and rebellion. And like the only place I can really compare that to is the context in which I know that aren't in Europe. So the Arab Spring started in squares across Middle Eastern countries and North African countries, in Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Taksim Square in Istanbul. And I think that space is such a big representation of a paradigm of society, of a paradigm of its structure. And I think that it's really important as queers to go into those spaces and deconstruct them. So like, I did some research on how Berghain, for example, is a perpetuation of the cisgender, like white supremacy in which Germany functions.
You chatted to
like,
Alice about that?
Yeah, of course I did. But like, you walk into Berlin, you walk into Berghain, and there's a massive like, image of a penis, and like, the brutalism of it, it's like a post-Cold War era sort of very whitewashed, Europeanized, very fortress Europe mentality. and it's very like straight, rigid, all of this stuff, and that is a paradigmatic representation of, you know, the LGBT narrative, the white narrative. And you know, Barthes wrote in his post-structuralism theory, he said that the Eiffel Tower, when it was created, represented a new transition for France as becoming less about the monarchy and less about religion and about that, and more to do with like maths, and more to do with like space and maths and geometry and that sort of thing. And as a result of that, I believe that like images, statues, space, they're things which we need to claim. And that's why you have campaigns like Roads Must Fall, because like physical things represent so much of the ideology in which they're placed. And I think that it's important for us to challenge those spaces. And when I walk down Oxford Street, I want to walk down Oxford Street being like, I am fucking queer and I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. And that's what we did when we did the funeral. It wasn't just about like combating the commercialism of it. It was also being like, I'm walking down the street, which I might not want to walk down in a fucking, you know, a veil with like a mesh veil with like black on, like my nails painted. I might not want to do that on a daily basis. And like when I was in Berlin, we did a solidarity with Istanbul Pride protest on the same day, on the 1st of July. We walked through the Turkish neighborhoods. We walked through Kreuzberg and Neukölln. And I was like, I'm wearing a fucking crop top in the center of Neukölln, in the center of Cottbussetor. Like I'm walking down, you know, these streets filled with people who would attack me, with not just Turks and Arabs and Middle Easterners, but also Germans who would on a daily basis see me, but strength in numbers, taking that space, reclaiming that space. It was such a liberating thing. And I think as a result of that, like, even though it's important for us to create our own narratives, we still need to perpetually provoke spaces which are like rampant within that context.
And tell us a bit more about, unpack a bit the indigenous aspect you stated. Well, I'm just thinking particularly what's going on in Brazil at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big aspect of it as well. You look at a lot of indigenous communities, and especially the concept of gender is something which indigenous communities are well ahead of any sort of like Europeanized mentality, any Europeanized binary that we've been, you know, exposed to, that we've grown up with. And I think that like the indigenous struggle, especially in Brazil, like the indigenous community is huge. The indigenous community in North America generally is huge as well. And these communities, they also link so much to the black struggle as well, because they have been oppressed in their own lands, or they've been taken out of their own lands. They've been forcibly assimilated. They've been put into a hierarchy. They've been hegemonized. And I think that those are the kind of forefronts of any sort of revolution or resistance. It comes from indigenous communities. It comes from black communities, the black diaspora. And I think that everyone else kind of like attaches onto that. Like, you know, the Middle East was colonized, but we didn't... I guess Palestinians kind of play into that as well, which is why obviously like a lot of like members of the black diaspora, they also tie in with the Palestine struggle a lot as well. And they say that like, you know, the Black Panthers, they linked a lot with being pro-Palestinian, because it's about the struggle of being occupied, of being erased, of being dispersed, of being forcibly expelled. And I think that people who have been forcibly expelled, people who have been scattered across the world, so the black diaspora, the Palestinian diaspora, indigenous diasporas, those are the ones who need to reclaim space. And we, as others, are kind of, as other members of the POC community or the minority communities, are the ones who kind of need to be like the backbone behind that happening. We should be like the sort of, we should be providing the strength in numbers while allowing for indigenous communities, black communities, and Palestinian communities to be the ones who employ that narrative of like, independence and revolution and resistance. Does that make sense?
Big time. And it also, we don't have time to chat about this, but relates to the wider ecological context of what's going on in the world at the moment. If we're looking at the queer environmental intersection, most people don't know, this isn't a question, most people don't know that the two Gay Liberation Front activists who started Pride in London with the rest of the Gay Liberation Front, the journey that inspired them was they went to a Black Power, a Black Panther conference, a revolutionary convention in somewhere in America with the Stonewall activists, and then they came back and started Gay Liberation Front. So the whole of Pride in London
is based on that intersection.
It's based on Black Power struggle.
Yeah.
But obviously the corporations, etc., won't want to talk about that.
I also, just really quickly, with what Levi was saying about in like 2019 about what you wanted to do in terms of like your own queer future, your own queer voice. For me, my issue has not existed as potently in terms of race, because in some contexts I am seen as white passing, in some contexts I am seen as distinctively Middle Eastern, so it is a bit complex in that sense. But for me, what Levi has with race, I have with gender. Like, my gender expression is something which I am just starting to come to understand in the past year or two. It's something which I realized isn't as rigid and as simple as I thought.
Yeah.
And that I don't define myself as man, I don't define myself as woman, but then I can define myself as a man, and I can also be effeminate. And coming to terms with the idea of like non-binary identity, trans femme identity. And this is why I really appreciate people like Alok and Travis. And, you know, I think that it's very important to have members of our community, especially young and of-colour members of our community, expressing and talking about the fact that this idea of gender, this notion of gender, is also rooted in white supremacy, is rooted in a very Eurocentric perspective of looking at things. And for me, it's about deconditioning my own gender identity, and that's what I want to do. I mean, I do define myself as masculine sometimes, like male, but then I also define myself as femme, and femme presenting as well. And they're not, I don't have to create that binary of one or the other. Like, I can be everything, and I'm just trying to come to terms with that, you know?
Yeah, big time. Thank you. I'm gonna